I'm sure we all know why curiosity at work is so important. And we're often told we need to be more curious or ask more questions. So things like innovation, things like building relationships, it all relies on being more curious. But have you ever thought about curiosity as a practice? What does it actually mean? And how can we practice being more curious? My guest on today's episode of Happier at Work is Julie Pham, and Julie is here to answer just that. She has a framework built around how to practice curiosity. So if you want to learn how to be more curious, if you want to learn how to do self-inquiry, build better relationships and better communication with your team, then today's episode is for you. If you enjoyed the episode, don't forget to leave a rating, a review, and leave a comment below. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Julie, you're so welcome to the Happier at Work podcast. Would you like to introduce yourself to listeners, a little bit about your career history and how you got to doing what you're doing today?
Yes, I'm Julie Pham. I founded and head a company called Curiosity Base, where we help people practice curiosity in the world, starting in the workplace, because that is where we spend most of our waking hours. And I'm based in Seattle.
I love that. And what got you into this? Like, was there something that really sparked you into doing what you're doing?
So, Aoife, I got to tell you, I wasn't always curious in the way that I think about curiosity now. So I used to think about curiosity in terms of just outward curiosity, accumulating knowledge. And now I think actually a lot about how curiosity has to do about relationship building and about practicing inward curiosity. And so in terms of what sparked it was actually my community building. So I have a lot of background in volunteering and community building, community organizing, and what I realized is when you bring together people from really diverse backgrounds, there's going to be friction that emerges. And you have to build trust, especially if you want to do things when people aren't actually getting paid to do them. And and what really helps with that is relationship building, self-awareness, clear communication, all of those I think of as the elements of practicing curiosity. And I saw in one particular, I'll share a story here. I remember I ran this program where it was a cross-sector collaboration program, and there were some people who really struggled and some people who really thrived. And the people who were really struggling were those who were so focused on getting a particular outcome and following a particular plan.
Ah,
And the particular people who were really thriving were those who were just, oh my gosh, look at what we're learning. I had no idea. We created something out of nothing. And what I saw is on these teams, because we had these project teams, if we had a critical mass of those who were, and then I identified, oh, this is curiosity, and if we had on any team, if we had a critical mass of those who were practicing that curiosity, it could uplift the morale of a team. And the inverse is true as well. If we had a
yeah.
critical mass of those who were so focused on just achieving the outcomes, it could actually take down the morale of a team. Because Aoife, there are a lot of bystanders. There are a lot of people who are just like waiting to see who talks the most, what's the dynamic. And so that was my kind of aha moment. Oh, it's about curiosity and and if we can do this in with volunteers, imagine what we could do with people who are paid to work together. So that's what got me to start my company.
I love that. Um, I suppose taking a step back from
Mhm.
this, and I think I know the answer to this already, but I'm going to ask it anyway. But do you think that curiosity is something that we can learn, or that we just naturally have this innate curiosity within us?
I think we are all curious.
Okay.
I think we all have it. And I think it can be fostered and nurtured and
Mm,
encouraged.
yeah.
So, and practiced. So not so much learned, but definitely practice. And so because I had mentioned, I think of curiosity as a practice. A lot of people talk about curiosity like it's a trait. You either have it or you don't.
Yeah. Yeah.
And Eva, what usually they need to be more curious. And you know what that means? I'm curious and they're not. Right? Like there's
Yes.
that,
Yeah. Yeah.
there's
The
that kind of
comparison. Yeah.
all right. But I actually think we're all curious. And it's actually about how do we encourage it? Because I mean, one of my favorite stats to cite is 70% of people face barriers asking questions at work. 70%. And actually in my work, I've found a lot of different reasons for that. And yet so many leaders, workplace, organizational leaders talk about we need to have curiosity. And yet why is it that people don't feel safe asking questions? They actually people report not feeling curious on a regular basis. So I actually think it is something that we need to nurture and foster.
Yeah. So if I'm kind of reading between the lines here a little bit, curiosity should foster innovation, but maybe people are so intent on following the plan that's been laid out that there's little room for curiosity, and they're so hung up maybe on following the strict plan that's been set out that they maybe feel frustrated, or they're they're kind of blocking themselves because they're not looking for solutions, or they're not kind of going into it with a curious mind. They're so focused on, but this is the plan that we agree to, this is the plan that I need to execute on.
And also this is the plan that worked before, right?
Ah, of course.
And
Let's
I
do it
also
this
think
way
that,
again. Yeah.
right? And I also think that now, I mean, I find a lot of perfectionism.
Ah,
And I
yeah.
think that's actually a symptom of our polarized world too, because I hear people feeling there needs right or wrong. There needs to be a right answer or a wrong answer. And things that aren't true must be lies. And and actually there's so much in between.
Mm,
And I think actually for us to really truly embrace curiosity, we have to also allow for multiple truths can coexist.
mm.
And a lot of this is actually just about perspective taking, which I think is quite hard. I remember actually finishing up a session, and at the end, this woman asked, she said, "Julie, you've taught us how to ask questions, but what I really want to know is how to answer questions."
Oh, that's deep, isn't it?
Yes, right. Because it's like, and that I think really speaks to there's such a need to have the right answer that people are can actually, if they ask questions, they're afraid of being seen as, well, you don't know the answer, or maybe being passive or being intentionally indecisive or looking like I wasn't listening. There's a lot of fears around saying I don't know.
Yeah, 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 yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So people are very reluctant then, not just to ask questions, but when questions are asked, how to give what they perceive is the right answer, because there has to be just one right answer. And interestingly, a recent conversation that I had on the podcast, we talked about the 9 different personality types according to the Enneagram. And number one is the perfectionist. And the
Mm-hmm.
perfectionist believes inherently that there is one way to do things, there is the one right way. And it's very hard for them to accept that there could be alternative perspectives, or there's not just one right way, or they don't have to have everything right and everything perfect. So it sounds like this sort of ties in with that concept as well.
Yes. And I mentioned that I think of curiosity as a practice, and that practice I actually liken it to meditation. It looks easy, but it's really hard. It's really
Yeah.
hard to still our minds. And so we kind of take it, I think we can actually take it for granted. And I think a lot of people focus on why we should be curious. And yet I think that's pretty, especially for people in our space, it's pretty obvious why we should be curious. I think we should actually focus more on the how. And
Yeah.
so there are these 3 elements to practicing curiosity. The first is self-awareness, the second is relationship building, and the third is clear communication. And so to elaborate a bit more, that first part, self-awareness, that's how do I be curious about myself? How do I practice inward curiosity? How do I ask myself questions and, oh, what am I actually feeling about this and why? And what's that based on? That second one, relationship building, is how do I be curious about other people? So, Aoife, how do I ask you questions and try to understand where you're coming from, and then I'll react to your stories. And then also, how do I share myself with you so that you can
Mm,
ask me questions?
yeah.
And that is reciprocity and that back and forth. Because I think a lot of people think of curiosity to this outward. And Aoife, I'll ask you all the questions, but not share anything about me, right? But then we don't have the relationship building.
Yeah.
And then that third part is clear communication. So this is how do I listen to understand? How do I ask questions when I don't understand? And then how do I also share specific examples and stories from my life? Because I think because people are afraid of having the wrong answer, we speak in a lot of generic terms. And we're afraid to be specific and concrete and share specific stories from our lives. And when people say, do you want me to talk about my family? I'm like, no, it's not. You don't have to talk about your family or your past traumas. It could just be work as personal too. How do we share
Yeah.
specific stories about that time we messed up or that bad manager we had or the first time we got maybe a performance review that wasn't favorable?
Mm.
So how do we be vulnerable there?
Yeah. Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah. No, I
And
love this.
so in nurturing each of those, if we can think about them as different elements, then it doesn't feel so be curious. It's
Yeah.
like, well, actually, the part I need to work on, I'm actually pretty good at the relationship building, but maybe I need to make more time for self-reflection.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. That's what I really like because you're so right in saying that when we're told that we're not curious, or when we are told that we are curious, or when we talk about curiosity, generally speaking, it's always focused on the outward, being curious about the world. Like, I feel like I'm naturally curious about the world in which we live in. I love exploring, I love traveling, but very rarely do we talk about the curiosity of, and or at least I haven't heard it phrased in this way, that going inward and raising your self-awareness is about being curious about the impact, about your own emotions, your own feelings, your own behaviors. Like, what's going on there, and how do I have that introspection? And again, there is a previous podcast episode about self-awareness if people want to go back and learn a little bit more about that. But I love that this is a concept of curiosity and being curious about what's going on for yourself. And again, multiple times on the podcast, we've talked about how it's so important as leaders. We tend to focus on those leadership skills, but actually one of the best skills that you can get is personal leadership, how to
Mm-hmm.
understand and manage yourself, because that's at the core of how you show up in the world. So I love that. Any advice if someone wants to get more curious on going inward to understand more about themselves? What are you seeing out there?
I think it can be helpful to think about it and take common concepts and then to go deep on them. So one of the concepts, one of the I'm really interested in respect. And
Yeah.
so let's take, and we use the word respect all the time. Be respectful. We want a respectful culture. And yet, what does that actually mean? What does that word actually mean? Because I actually
Mm,
think we can agree on how respect feels, to feel seen, heard, appreciated. What we disagree about is what does it look like? Aoife, do you want to be CC'd on all emails or not? Right?
yeah.
Some people are just, no, send me everything. I feel excluded if you don't. And others are just, why are you sending me all this stuff? Only send me an email if you need me to do something or if
Yeah.
there's a reason. And so the going back to how that links to curiosity though is, so we take a concept like respect, and then I can, going through those three elements. First one, self-awareness. How do I want respect? What's that
Mm,
based on? And then the second element, relationship building. Aoife, how do you want respect? Oh, well, what's
mm,
that based on? What are the stories around that? And then, and Aoife, I'm going to tell you how I want respect. And you will ask me questions. And then back and forth, we'll actually have new ideas just from sharing that. And then that third part, the clear communication, is being specific with our stories. So I'll give you an example. A lot of times people say, well, punctuality is respectful. Why is it respectful? Because it's important to do that. Well, why is it important? Because it's respectful, right?
yeah.
And
Yeah. Yeah.
and I'll share with you a specific story. Growing up, my mom was always late picking me up from school. So the school staff had to wait with me. And I
Mm,
felt so much anxiety waiting for her. And every time I saw a car coming through the parking lot, I'm like, is that her? And I still carry that to this
yeah.
day.
Mm,
And so we can also have, that's all, that story also shows how we can have positive and negative examples
yeah.
of
Yeah. Yeah.
respect,
And
right?
so
Like because someone else
that's,
could have, that's my story. And if I
yeah.
tell that to you, you will remember Julie feels anxiety around time.
Mm,
And if someone else could have that exact same experience and be like, what's the problem? Like
yeah.
time is flexible, right? We can have the same experience in different reactions.
Yeah. Yeah.
So that's why it's so important to not just share the story, but share how it impacted us. And
Yeah.
so, in any case, this is a long winded way of saying when we say practicing curiosity, we can actually take concepts like respect. Another one that we do a lot is, what does success mean to you?
Yeah, yeah,
What's that based on? Who are the models in my life? What does it mean to someone else? And because how often in workplaces are we talking about goal setting?
mm,
And some people are talking about it in terms of tangible, measurable goals, and other people are talking about it in terms of feelings. And they're literally talking past each other. And that's because we haven't slowed down and said, oh, well, we need both what success looks like and what it feels like. And we're just seeing it differently. How you're talking about it in terms of tangible, and I'm talking about in terms of feeling. Maybe I should try tangible and you should try feelings, and we can
yeah,
both learn.
yeah, yeah. I think the success thing in particular is so relatable because I think the society that we've grown up in, success is a promotion, a nice job title, a nice car, a big house, a family, a partner. All of these things are deemed as, oh, you've had success by doing that. But I think by flipping it, because, and I don't know, do you have stats around this, but do most people think about it or do they think about how they want to feel about success? I would argue that there's a limited number of people who want to understand what success feels like, but I think it's important to understand what it feels like.
So when I so actually I'm going to share the story of how I got to this, and then I'll share what I see with my clients. So because my aha moment was a friend, this was about maybe 5 years ago, now 4 years ago. She asked, what does success look like to you? And I really struggled, even
Yeah.
though I'd been asked that question numerous times, and even though I've asked that question of other people. And that time when she asked me, I was really struggling. This is before I started my business. And I realized, it's why do we always talk about what does success look like? Why don't we ask what does success feel like?
Yeah.
And how would we answer that differently? Because then I realized, oh, success feels like for me freedom.
Yeah.
And then to also follow this up with what do we need to do and what do we need to stop doing? Because I think oftentimes this we're constantly thinking about the to-dos. I need to do this, I need to do this, I need to do this. And we don't think about the what I call the to-don'ts. What do we need to stop
Yes.
doing?
Yeah. Yeah.
And so for me to feel freedom, what I needed to stop doing was asking permission.
Yeah.
And that's when I realized I had to go from being an employee to an employer. Um, and so now, Aoife, I'm going to share what I hear from my clients because it's actually surprising. So I haven't I'll usually just do hand polls or polling. I don't
Yeah. Yeah.
track, right? Because we'll take them through this exercise of what does success look like for you personally? And then some people will say at work. It's really important here, as we were talking about earlier, the personal. We have to start with the personal. And if people can't define success in their own personal lives, how are they going to do it on the team?
Mm,
So starting with that first. And so then I'll take them through what does success look like to you? And then what does success feel like to you? And then compare. And then I'll ask, raise your hand if it was easier for you to think about what it looks like and what it feels like. And it's always so interesting to see there is a mix. And then people around in the room can see, like, what? You thought it was easier to do feels? You thought it
yeah.
was easier to do looks? I mean, I've been in organizations where it would be 75% feels.
Wow. Okay.
And
Yeah.
I've
Yeah.
been in organizations where it's just like 50-50 or the flipped, right?
Yeah.
And then I'll even ask, was it easier when you think about your personal life versus you on the team?
Yeah.
Because and so, and a lot of my work actually is around helping people analyze for themselves, practice that inward curiosity. What All of this is dynamic.
Mm,
It depends on the context. So what's happening here? Maybe I feel like I have more control over my life, my personal life versus my work life, or vice versa. And so in any case, that's when we practice curiosity, we can take something as something we take for granted, like the idea of success or the idea of respect, and really talk about it in that way. We actually get a lot of people think my work is teaching them how to be respectful. And I always have to say, no, I'm not teaching you how to be respectful. You already know how to be respectful. I actually want to guide you on how to be curious about respect. And
mm,
that to them really opens them up because, I mean, Aoife, people think, oh, here's the trainer going to teach us how to be respectful. And I have to dispel that. And then it really, you can see their bodies relax. And it's like, oh, you think I'm respectful already? Oh, we're just going to talk about it looks different for each of us.
Love that. There's so much I want to unpack there. This whole idea, I think, of success, first of all, and like how to define that, and the looks versus feels. I think I've been very much a looks person,
Hmm.
and for anyone who's listening today, maybe ask yourself, try and see what does that look like for you and what does it feel like and which one was harder. For me, the feels I think is harder, but then I kind of think that maybe the feels is what it should be. And I always think it's a journey and we shouldn't be deferring, let's say, happiness, like our happiness at work. We shouldn't be striving and striving. We should feel challenged, but we shouldn't be striving and striving and saying, I'm going to be happy when this project is over or when I get the promotion or when I move teams or whatever it might be. It shouldn't be about that. It should be about how you feel along the journey. And it's okay to feel challenged, but you should still be feeling like you're thriving as opposed to surviving or striving, that you're not quite getting there. I love the idea of defining personal success. And Oprah has this famous clip where she's talking to Trevor Noah, and she's Trevor asks her, what's getting in the way? Like, why can't people get what they want? And she said, people can't get what they want because they don't know what they want.
Hmm.
And so, again, an invitation for people to be curious about what is it that I really want. I think our default mode is to look at what other people have or what other people are doing and say, I want that or I want to do that, as opposed to thinking internally, how do I want to feel about my life? How do I want my life to look like? Who do I want to be in my life? And then define our success based on this is what I want from my life, and I'll know that I'm successful when it feels like this or when it looks like this, whatever it might be. Any thoughts on that, or are you seeing like that
Yeah.
people
And
find
I
it
actually,
really hard to define what that actually means?
yeah. And so I've actually taught, I've taken this senior leaders, executives through this exercise, and it's always fun to see them react with, I've never asked myself that question for me
Yeah,
personally. We
yeah,
talk about it in terms of what are the goals for the org. The other thing is I actually think that both of them are important. So it's not that
mm,
success feels like it's more important than success looks like. It's more about finding alignment and then
yeah,
being able to define each of them so that there is, because sometimes if people only when once they have to articulate both, they could say, for example, I'll do personal examples. Um, Someone could say, oh, I want to lose this much weight. I actually had
mm,
this when I was developing, I talked about this with a friend. I want to lose this much weight. And it's just like, well, how do you want to feel? Like, oh, I want to feel sexy. I want to feel healthy. And it's like, well, all this dieting is not making you feel great along the way, right? And so sometimes the looks like goal can actually clash with the feels like,
oh, interesting. Yeah, yeah,
and so it's about getting them in alignment. And so sometimes, and so it's just, wait a minute, if I want to feel this, do I actually need to do the looks like? Do I, for example, I might say I want to feel fun, and I think, oh, I need to look success looks like running a marathon. But if I think running is boring, then maybe I could do one of those obstacle races, right?
mm,
Instead, and that will align. And then we also have to think about the feeling. So maybe I say, like, I want to feel stable, right? I want to feel stable. And well, maybe my looks like goal needs to have I need to get my finances in order.
yeah, yeah.
And that can help inform the looks like. So actually, if we start with one, then it could inform the other one, because what we want is alignment, not that one is more important than the other. It's just, how do we make sure that as we're working on this, that our looks like and our feels like are in alignment, because sometimes they clash.
Mm, yeah, yeah. I think that's really interesting, and it is again this how do you want to feel along the journey as opposed to how do you want to feel when you reach that destination.
And I'll give you
And
a workplace example since this is
mm,
happier at work. So is is you've seen those teams where it's just like, oh, we can just get this many in sales. And
oh
at
yeah,
the end of the day, they feel exhausted, right? They're just and they feel they don't feel that sense of um accomplishment because they're just exhausted, right? And or as at the cost of that. So it's actually, or here's another example. You could say, hey, you want to feel for a sales team, we want to feel empowered. Well, and then the looks like is we want all the sales managers to be checking the salespeople's funnels to
yeah,
make sure that they are appropriately doing their work. Or are they going to feel micromanaged? Maybe. And
definitely
so
not
then
empowered.
is there another way to feel empowered? Is there another looks like? And so that's just, it's about getting it in alignment because
Yeah,
this works. What's nice about this framework is because we call it what is explore what success looks like and feels like is it can work. You start with your personal life, and once people practice it in their personal life, then they can move to the team. Because if we go straight to the team, because sometimes I have people who are like, no, let's just go straight to the team. I don't want to talk about the personal.
yeah,
What happens there is, when we make team goals is, oh, well, if we didn't get it, well, that's because, that department didn't do their job.
yes, yeah, yeah, yeah. Sales are
Right? Like
blaming
it's so
marketing,
easy to
marketing are blaming
basically
sales.
say to blame it on other people when we don't
Yeah,
meet our goals. And
yeah,
that's why it's so important to practice that personal accountability so we can get used to that so that we can then apply it to us in as a part of a team.
yeah. So building that self awareness, which includes a sense
Mm-hmm.
of accountability, responsibility,
Mm-hmm.
and then in terms of the relationship building, this idea of reciprocity. And when you were speaking earlier about that, Julie, this what sprang to my mind was I could be asking you lots of questions, but you're not asking me questions. So it
Mm-hmm.
appears that you're not really curious about what I have to say and you don't really care. And if you want to translate that then into that means that you don't respect me or you don't care, whatever that means.
Mm-hmm.
How do we build curiosity into our relationships? Do you have some examples of things that we could do or questions that we could ask to build that?
So sometimes if you're experiencing, oh, this person's I'm asking them a bunch of questions, they're not asking me any questions. Sometimes that's literally because they don't know how to ask questions or they don't have the self-awareness. So if you're close enough, and I've sometimes done this with family, it's just, do you have any questions? Ask me. Like,
Yeah,
you can give cues too, like, hey, let me
yeah, yeah.
share some things about yourself to see if they pick that up.
Hmm.
And or you can even just say, hey, feel free to ask me about anything too. I
Like give an
so
invitation.
yeah, give an invitation because I think we can perceive that as they are being selfish or not curious about us. I think learning culturally, sometimes it's considered rude to ask questions.
Yeah, yeah,
So just being aware of that as
yeah.
well. I mean, I'm actually really proud of with my partner, his son, uh, at some stage, I think when he was 10, I started saying, do you have anything to ask me? And now he's really good at asking questions.
Oh,
I'd say, how are you doing? And
brilliant.
then he would tell me, and then I'd be them like, do you have anything to ask me? And then it got to this point where we'd come into the room, how are you doing? Because he didn't want me to prompt him.
Yeah, yeah.
Right. And now as a 17-year-old, he's really good at asking questions.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
mhm.
Brilliant. Love that. And I suppose something else that sprung to mind, and I can't remember where I saw this or where I read it, but was this idea that for someone who asks a lot of questions, maybe you're perceived as being nosy,
Mhm.
not just curious, that you're asking questions because you're intruding or you're being rude or something like that, that it's perceived in this way. And then equally, when you don't ask questions, you're perceived as being rude because you're not that interested or you don't seem to care or want to know anything
Mhm.
about the person. So I guess with each individual or within each relationship, it's about finding that balance of you're not asking too many that you're coming across as being too nosy, but you're not asking too few that you're not really genuinely curious about the person.
Yeah, and I think that there are different intentions at play, right?
Hmm.
Because sometimes people ask a lot of questions because they want to build a relationship. They want connection. They want to find, I want to get information so I can find that connection point with you. And then sometimes people are asking questions because they actually just want to know. And maybe they're just, oh, I want to know what they know or study their behavior. It's actually not with the intent to build a relationship.
Mm.
And I don't think that's necessarily it's kind of that's just the way that person thinks,
Yeah.
right? And we all think differently. And you know what's interesting about that is that's actually very much of an outcomes oriented problem solver mindset.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah.
Right? So
Yeah.
the things that we're just and you know you if I, sometimes people get criticized for being too much of a relationship builder, right? And so and so I look at it as we all approach these things differently. There's no right or wrong way. And in conversation with one another, it's just how do we adjust? I've also heard people say, it's not my job to educate you, so I'm not going to share anything with you. Go read
Wow.
it in a book, right? And you know, it's not my job to educate you about blah 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 about my personal lived experience. And the way that I react to that is, I'm not looking for an education. I'm looking for engagement. I'm looking for back and
Mm.
forth. If you think that you only have things to teach me and and you don't have anything to learn from me, then I actually don't want to be part of this conversation either.
Yeah.
So how do we have that back and forth? And I'll just lastly say sometimes I think we focus so much on I think questions can questions that we don't want to answer or that we feel uncomfortable answering can provoke outrage. I can't believe you asked that question. I can't believe they asked that question.
Yeah.
And we're so focused on that outrage, we're not then practicing the inward curiosity of why am I bothered by that question?
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Can I share an example?
Yeah. Of course.
Okay. So this happened about 10 years ago. And I remember I was I was working my family's newspaper and I was desperate to leave the family business and enter the corporate world. And so I was doing tons of informational interviews. And I talked to this young woman who was working at a tech company, and I want this was the tech company I wanted to work at. And so she's asking me all these. She's asking some questions, and then she says, do you mind if I ask you if you have a degree?" And then I say, "Yes, I have a PhD." And I get off the phone, and this is an acquaintance, so it's not a total stranger.
Mm.
And I am so outraged. Aoife, I'm so outraged. How dare she ask me that, right?
Yeah.
And she looked down on me, blah, blah, blah. And I actually carried that underdog story for years. I actually even spoke about it. Like, look at that as an example of her being condescending. And then someone asked me, "Julie, why were you offended by that?" And then I was just, wait, why was I?
Yeah.
And I realized, oh, because I actually have lots of friends who didn't go to college. Yet
Mm.
I had this, well, obviously she would know that I'm educated, right? And so I had to kind of look at my own internal assumptions about what it means to be educated and not, and practice
Yeah.
some inward curiosity there.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
So so I
No, I
think that
can. You're
sometimes we
kind of.
focus so much on the outrage that we don't pause and go like, why is
Why?
this
Why
bothering
is
me?
that? Why has that triggered me so much?
Yeah, because we can
That.
also
Yeah.
ask, hey, um can I ask you why you're asking? Because now I look back at it and it's just I could have maybe there's a special program for people who go to college.
Yeah.
I don't know
Yeah.
why she asked me that question because I was
Yeah.
just so absorbed by the outrage.
Yeah, no, it's funny. I think we have our blinkers on when we get asked something that's a bit
Mhm,
triggering, and you're like,
mhm,
answer the question and feel really angry about it rather than saying, like, I'm curious, why is that important? Like,
mhm,
is there some special reason that, like, do you need to have a degree to work here? Do you need,
mhm,
whatever
mhm,
the answer might be, but to get curious about it as well. But everything that you're saying ties back with this idea of reciprocity. So when you're
mhm,
talking about, oh, you go educate yourself, I'm not here to educate you, it's like, but no, we can learn from each other. The whole point of a relationship is reciprocity. It's not one way,
mhm,
otherwise one or other of the people are going to get really annoyed and there
mhm,
won't be a relationship anymore. But the third aspect is around clear communication, and I love this first part of it, which is the listen to understand, because I think oftentimes when we're communicating with people, we're trying to think of what we're going to say next, what am I going to ask next. rather than really listening to what they're saying. Again, going back to this fear of, am I going to look stupid if I have to take time to process what they've said before I can formulate a response or a question or whatever it might be? Do you want to talk us through the steps in the clear communication aspect?
Yes. So with for leaders, the talking muscle is so much more obvious than the listening muscle, right? And so listening can be quite difficult. We can lose them. We can lose the practice of it. And so in this, there's listening to understand, asking questions when we don't understand. I think we've talked quite a bit about asking questions and sharing the specific story. So for the listening, it's actually my big role here is just to listen to the other person. And so when I'll go back to an exercise we do when we take people through the success. And so after they share, we'll put people in partners, share what your vision for what a success look like to you. They're listening to each other. And the thing I tell people, just listen, don't give advice.
Mm.
Because when you hear someone say, this is what I want to do, it's so tempting to say, oh, well, this is what you need to do. Have you tried this? To give each other advice, to try to problem solve, because they see that hearing a goal as a problem that needs to be overcome.
Yeah.
And what if we were just to listen? And it's so, just in that, just by putting that framing around it, people then they actually have to listen. And then they are learning different things. And it's also kind of giving permission, because oftentimes in the workplace, we're expected to solve problems. When we talk, it's just like, oh yes, well, how do we approach that? Versus just, let me just understand where you're coming from and give you the space to share something. Because if we actually just listen long enough, sometimes people will share things that they didn't even expect to share.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think we're
So,
so
mhm, mhm,
often focused on, you hear something and we're rewarded for solving problems at work as well. We tend to move up the ranks because we've been able to solve problems. But I think I'm seeing this more and more, that leaders are using this coaching approach, which
mhm,
is curiosity. It's asking
mhm.
questions without an agenda. It's asking questions because you're curious. You want to help people to find the solutions to their own problems. But that doesn't even necessarily have to be the case in this scenario. It can just be a listening thing without the need to jump in and say, do you know what I would do? Or do you know what I have done in the past? Or the temptation, I think, is so strong a lot of the time to give people advice as if we are the best people to be able to tell them what to do in whatever scenario. We won't talk about all of the different biases that we're all coming with and all of the different experiences that we've had to lead us down the path that we're on. But I think it's so interesting to think about these things and to have a framework around practicing curiosity, as opposed to just saying, oh, I need you to be more curious, or you need to be more curious. Like, what does that actually mean? And now we have a framework to actually to build upon, to use that. And I love how you talk about it, not just externally but internally, to really understand ourselves and how we show up, and then that almost leads on to how we show up with other people, and this idea of reciprocity and being in a relationship. And then the clear communication, which is so important for the basis of any sort of relationship, for any sort of curiosity as well, being able to clearly ask those questions. So I love how you've put together that framework, Julie. Is there anything else that you wanted to share on the podcast today before we wrap things up?
I will just say that all of this depends. You can, when approaching a difficult conversation, even on my own team, we say, I want to practice some curiosity here, which is code for just, we're going to slow down. I'm just truly trying to understand where you're coming from. And also all of this actually depends on both sides, on all parties wanting to learn from one another. And sometimes they don't. I was in a conversation with a friend yesterday she was like, I think we need to work on communication skills. And from everything she was telling me about the person, it's like, no, I don't think that person actually wants to learn from you. And if they don't, then you can't have a conversation.
Yeah.
It's
Then
not
it's
about
just one
communication skills.
sided. Yeah.
Communication skills are just a vehicle,
Mm.
right? A channel. But if the person, so for all of this to work, we actually ask ourselves um, the question of, am I willing to learn from someone else? Because oftentimes we go in just, do I want them to learn from me? Yes. And the second question, am I willing to learn from them? And if I actually had to build this as a speed bump, this it took me a couple of years in my business to realize this because I was encountering people who, when here, these are how you ask questions. This is how you can ask questions. And I would hear people say, why do I need to ask a question when I know the answer? I know why they did what they did. And I
Oh,
realized I was assuming that they would want to know.
yeah.
And
Yeah,
so
yeah.
that's when I had to build the speed bump of these two questions
Mm.
to slow them down and get them to reflect, am I actually ready to enter this conversation and learn from someone else? Because if I am not, if I, because we can easily perform it, we can perform curiosity.
Ah,
We have to be honest with ourselves.
yeah.
And if we aren't, then go practice that conversation with someone else. You could actually hurt the conversation if you have it too early, if you're not ready, if you don't actually want to learn from
Yeah.
someone else.
I think that's so interesting, isn't it? And we assume that people do things the way they do them, and if we're not open to understanding more about why they behave in the way that they behave, and we make simple assumptions about why they do what they do. And I love the kind of almost double layer, because you are assuming that people wanted to learn the questions from you, so there's almost kind of a double thing going on there. um but I think it's such a great, like, we have to be willing participants, basically, to
Mm-hmm.
want to learn from other people if we're genuinely curious. Otherwise it's just performative, and we're just
Mm-hmm.
showing up pretending that we're curious, but
Mm-hmm.
actually we don't really care
Mm-hmm.
one way or the other. So Julie, the question I ask everyone who comes on the podcast: what does being happier at work mean to you?
Feeling that I can learn in the workplace, that it's safe for me to say, I don't know. Uh, I want to explore this, and that feeling that the organization is a learning organization. They're not just extracting my labor and it's not just transactional. It's actually a mutually beneficial. We are learning and benefiting from one another.
I love that. So it's the learning organization is like it's the two-way street,
Mm-hmm.
really, isn't it? That they're
Mm-hmm.
learning and they're willing to listen to what it is that you have, the experience that you have had, or the stories that you want to share, whatever it might be, that they're willing to listen. And if I'm hearing again between the lines, they've created psychological safety where it's okay
Mm-hmm.
to be curious and it's okay to ask questions. Brilliant. And if people want to connect with you, if they want to find out more about what it is that you do, what's the best place they can do that?
The best place to reach me is on LinkedIn. I'm really active there, so just find Julie Pham. You can also go to my website, curiositybase.com, or I have a book called Seven Forms of Respect, and you go formsofrespect.com. And so those are places you can reach me and find out more about my work.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for your time today, Julie. I really, really enjoyed this conversation.
Aoife, thank you so much. I've been a big fan of your podcast, so I feel really fortunate to get to be a guest.